And we are back up with our coffee and conversations. We'll tell you some more information about what we have ahead of us. So be ready to mark your calendars for some excellent speakers we have coming up over the next couple of months. We have an excellent speaker today, and we will introduce you to him in just a moment, and he will fill us in a little bit about the early history of Vietnam. It's not so much about the actual Vietnam War, but there is so much background to this conflict, especially those of you who served in the Vietnam War. You're probably well aware of that. Going back through the French occupation of Vietnam, going back through Chinese occupation of Vietnam, there's a huge, rich history there of a culture that was always trying to gain its own independence, its own self-governance throughout its history. So we will learn a lot about that today. So I hope you guys have brought your notebooks. You can take lots of notes and everything, because there'll be a test at the end. No, I'm just kidding. Couple of reminders here before we get started. Let's see if we're working here. Well, we'll do this the old-fashioned way, folks. We want to thank our generous museum donors, all of our members, everybody from the Broomfield Community Foundation, the Rotary Club, of course, Colorado's SCFD, all of these groups. We always appreciate it. And we appreciate your donations, too. If you are able to, as you know, we have lots of our little jars around here, or however you wish to donate. It helps us run this museum, and we greatly appreciate it. And if you want to become a member as well, we absolutely can do that for you. We can facilitate that today. So let one of the members here at the museum, whether they're wearing a red vest or blue vest, know you're interested, and we'll get you signed up. If you have had a chance, or if you have not, we encourage you to please sign in on our visitors log. That's very important for us to keep a number of people who visit, the number of people who attend the museum. We have one downstairs here, so if you came in through the back door, if you can sign in there, or upstairs we have one as well as through the front entrance, if you can sign in there, we appreciate that. Please, if you haven't had a chance, turn off your phone or at least put it on silence. We just appreciate that for our speaker. And again, thank you for any donations. That's what helps this museum run. Future coffee and conversations. So as you know, we had this great renovation. I hope you guys have had a chance to take a look at the new carpeting upstairs. It is definitely looking great. And we also, now that we are back running, we are going to continue this focus on the Vietnam War. Over the next couple of speakers that we have here coming to the museum for our coffee and conversations, we have a great number of veterans. What we are focused on is listening and hearing and learning about their personal stories, what they went through, those individual stories of each one of those veterans. And we have got a great crew lined up for you this spring and summer. May 10th, we have Gary Toby, who is an A-4 Skyhawk pilot who flew off of the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise during the Vietnam War, earned the DFC, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and also assisted in the rescue of several downed airmen in certain incidents. So we'll be able to hear that story from Gary on May 10th. On May 24th, we have Paul Strange, who is a Vietnam veteran who served in the 4th Infantry Division. And there was very controversial, some of you know, of course, the incursion into Cambodia during the Vietnam War, and he was part of that, so we will hear about that. And then on June 14th, we have Peter Lagasse, who is a retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineer Lieutenant Colonel, so I'm sure Mike Fellows will be very interested in meeting him. And he established a lot of these ports in Vietnam, which again, some of you who served there, you know those were very crucial for incoming supplies, outgoing, all kinds of information, and of course supply work, logistics that was going on during the war. Another thing that we have in coordination with this is our Vietnam War exhibit upstairs, which is a spectacular job done by our very own Flint Whitlock, as you see in the photograph there. So we encourage you to take a look at that even today. If you haven't seen it already on your way out of the museum, might be great for you to go up there and take a peek at it. We also have Noah Webb, another Vietnam War veteran who produced a series of paintings, oil paintings, and many of these were where he captured scenes of life in Vietnam when he served there. And they are great. They're all through the upstairs hallway if you have a chance to go walk through there. He is an outstanding artist, amazing artist. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to our very own Matt Ake. And Matt is going to tell you about the early history of Vietnam. So Matt, come on up. Any questions before we get started? I'm sure that Matt will be able to answer some questions after the presentation, correct?
We hope so.
We hope so. All right, thank you, folks.
We're going to ask real hard ones.
I knew that was coming from you, Gary. One of the things that makes something like this a bit difficult is that Don used the H word, history, and right there it says historical. Now, when you say that to a crowd, what I like to see is the eyelids start to get heavy before you say anything, right? And then the other half of the crowd thinks, I wish I'd have coffeed up a little more before this started. Okay, so I don't want you to think of this as history. I want you to use a different word this morning, legacy. If you were here a few weeks ago, the auditorium, you heard a bunch of people do presentations on their experience in the Vietnam War. And it was amazing. It was an amazing afternoon of experiences from people. But when we as Americans think of Vietnam, we think of that as part of our legacy. Well, I don't want you to think of this as history. I want you to think of what happened in those 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, America is now part of Vietnam's legacy. So I want you to think of it in that way. So I picked the title Before the War, but what I realized is, like many things in human history, war has been a somewhat prevalent topic in Vietnam. And I want to talk about, not war, but I want to talk about the human events that take place. And for better or worse, war is a place of perspective, because wars happen and they don't happen in a vacuum. Now, we're all going to hope that this works. And it does. All right, here we go. I thought this was a wonderful place to open up. And this was a brief conversation between the King of Vietnam and his court during the invasion of the Mongol Empire, which we will discuss a little bit later on. And the king asks, if we fight, we shall all be killed. But if we submit, we shall all be slaves. What shall we do? And one of his generals responded, Your Majesty, if you wish to submit, then cut off my head first. For while it remains on my shoulders, the kingdom shall stand. I want to emphasize this word, kingdom. Nation, people, us. The kingdom shall stand. And what we're going to figure out is that throughout Vietnam's history, being a small country, it has had outside influence try to influence the way it operates. And I want you to think of a word in terms of Vietnam and their history. Kingdom, independence.
Hey, Matt,
Yeah.
would you stand either to the left or to the right, because you're blocking half the screen?
Can I stand to the left or to the right?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, I'll stand over here.
You can move that stand. Yeah, you
Okay, I'll move that stand. Now remember, when you're doing a professional presentation, always fix the logistics during the presentation. Never do it beforehand.
It's noteworthy.
It is. Lesson learned. I brought up these 3 slides because I wanted everyone to see Vietnam in 3 different perspectives. And now I'm going to take out my 7-foot-long pointer and start using it. The first one This is really like trying to scramble eggs with a tennis racket. It really is. This is modern Vietnam. And today I'm going to talk about areas in Vietnam, some of which you're familiar with, others you may not have so much knowledge of. But we'll start here in the north, and we're going to talk about a lot of the origin of Vietnam is in the Red River Delta, which is up in this area where Hanoi is. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Gulf of Tonkin at the very end of the presentation. And I'm doing this so you can all see and appreciate and visualize, in case I have a slide that doesn't actually have a map on it. Yes?
Just quick, on the back side of your handout, we have the blow up of the map.
Oh.
Of your thing there, which has the mod current
Okay.
Vietnam.
Okay, so in case you don't know, on the back side of your handout, there is a map of Vietnam so you can follow along. And as my teacher used to say, please read silently while I read aloud. Okay, so this is basically the Gulf of Tonkin. And we're going to talk about two more areas. We're going to talk about an area called Champa. And Champa was an old kingdom, part of Vietnam. But what you're going to notice is a geographic peculiarity in that Champa occupied an area fairly similar to what we considered the division of Vietnam during the war. And that is this area south. And I don't know exactly, I do believe I have a map that shows that. We're also going to talk about a place called Cochin China, which is down here in the Mekong Delta, which was of special interest to the French during their period of hegemony here in Vietnam. Now, the second thing I'd like to talk about, now that we understand what the country looks like, I'd like to show you where Vietnam is in the world. And right here is Vietnam. And to the north is this country called China. And China's motto should be, we've been playing the long game for 3,000 years. So you have China to the north, and we're going to talk about them. Slightly about right here, you have Japan, and we're going to talk about them. Now, at the far end of this screen, you have Europe. And at this end of the screen, you have the United States of America. All are major players in the history of Vietnam, in the legacy of Vietnam. Now, I put this up just to kind of give you a European and American perspective of how the Western powers saw Southeast Asia. And I guess what I'm saying is this is French Indochina. This, in part, is what would be called British Indochina, or the part influenced by British. And this is Indonesia, Malaysia, this part of the world was part of the Dutch East Indies Company under the Netherlands. Now this is Spanish influence. And I'm going to ask you, during the period of World War II, what's a little different about the Philippines that is different from this map? Anyone?
U.S. control.
Thank you. There you go. Hey, and just so you know, Mike, there's a map on the back of the... I'm sorry. No, that's an...
Not of the Philippines.
But not of the Philippines. Yes, sir.
The Philippines was acquired in the Spanish-American War in 1898.
Yes, sir.
And I believe they picked up Guam and some of those other territories.
Yes, sir. During the Spanish-American War, you are correct. And so this precedes that map.
Right, and Philippines was supposed to get its independence in 1948. That was promised by FDR. However, World War II broke out, and Japan took it over and tried to get them sooner.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the Coast Prosperity Sphere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a very good point. And that brings home the fact that, note the word we use when we look at this, colonization, as a Western concept. The hint right now is we saw these as colonies. These countries didn't have that perspective. There is one country that has a special distinction, and they hold it very much as a personal national pride. That's the country of Thailand. It was never colonized by the West. That's why it's in gray right here. Siam, Thailand. So I want you to keep all three of these perspectives in mind as we begin our discussion. And please, this isn't coffee and lecture, it's coffee and conversation. So please, I appreciate the input because that really adds to the conversation. And if you see I'm in over my head, you can go ahead and answer for me. Those who would influence. I'm going to talk about 5 primary participants in the history of Vietnam. Now, I'm not saying there aren't others, but these are combatant countries or empires, whichever you wish to call them, that had influence at some point in Vietnamese legacy and influenced the country that Vietnam is today. Now, when we look at these 5 countries, what do you think they all had in common during their period of intervening in Vietnam? Can anyone guess?
Probably, their individual influence made a difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Two, that Vietnam area, Indochina, was French, and Japan asked for permission from the French Vichy government. When they said no, they just took it over.
Absolutely.
And that everybody had a say in there until Ho Chi Minh was given the North, and their constitution is based on our constitution. His favorite was George Washington.
Okay. I'm scared now because maybe he should be doing this and not me. He has a really good insight into that. Go.
I'll shut my mouth.
No, I don't, but that's amazing, that level of insight and knowledge of the history. You have a question, Sir Josh?
No, I was going to say the Mongol Empire particularly did a lot of cultural and governmental influence all
Okay.
over the globe, so they influenced a lot of governments that we see today.
Okay.
But they all had strong militaries.
That's exactly it. They were all world powers at the time that they intervened in Vietnam. That's it, world powers. And you're right, every single one of them in some way influenced the Vietnam that we see today.
Well, wouldn't it be economic? I mean, they probably saw some value in that part of the world. Otherwise, they wouldn't deploy their troops down there. So they saw some advantage of rubber plants or whatever.
And that goes to the slide I had earlier, Gary, that's talked about colonization. Colonization in many ways is an economic enterprise, whether it be backed by private enterprise or by government itself. So you're very much on mark with what the economies and what the nature of these invasions, of these interventions in Vietnam was about. Actually, that's pretty much on spot. Now, I put up this first slide because I wanted everyone to see this. This thing, this entity, this northern part in the Red River Delta started 2900 BC. That's an old country. Now, like every good country, there's a myth story. How did we come into being? And it's the time-old Dragon King meets Forest Fairy Queen, and they have 100 children, and those children become the tribes of Vietnam. Now, I'm sure the Dragon King was quite proud of himself, but I'm pretty sure she was asking for separate bedrooms at some point during this discussion, okay? So we have this dispersion of the Vietnamese people. And what we have to keep in mind is the Vietnamese people at this time were not one homogeneous group of people. They could more so be different tribes, different groups of people, all living within some area defined as this, really. Now, with every good mythology story, we have to have a hero. And that's this gentleman right here, Tan Gong. How many of y'all saw me do the presentation on Finland? Did anyone see me do that? If you thought my pronunciation of Finnish is terrible, you ain't seen nothing yet. I'm going to do the best I can with spelling and the best I can with pronunciation. Tan Gong is one of the folk heroes of Vietnam. And what his claim to fame was, when Vietnam was invaded at one point, he turned into an enormous iron giant, and he single-handedly defeated what was called the outsiders, or as one story I read, the people from the north. What country is to the north of Vietnam? It could have been a problem. I can't think of it, but I'm sure we'll get to it in just a minute. China. This is where our story begins. And perhaps of all the nations we're going to discuss, China has the greatest influence over the Vietnam we have today because they had 1,000 years of doing it. So I want to start the story at the beginning. China has its first enterprise into Vietnam around 222 BC. And what the Chinese Qin dynasty sent were 500,000 troops. I'm curious, does anyone know how many troops there were who hit the beaches at D-Day? I didn't know this either. Does anyone know? Between 150 and 160,000. China came to play. They sent 500,000 troops. And what they did was they had a general named General Cao Cao. I hope I got that right. He was already an accomplished general who had basically seized other parts of Southeast Asia, and this was his opportunity to seize part of part of Vietnam. And Vietnam was called Ba Yue, which is kind of ironic because that means 100 Ba. Yue, when translated into Vietnamese, means kind of southerner, person far away, okay? So he comes, and he comes forth and he conquers. But then suddenly, there's a great turmoil in China. And the Qin dynasty begins to collapse. And somebody has to enter that power vacuum. Well, he decides he can't influence China, but where can he establish himself as something more than just an army general? He can become an emperor. So he changes the name of Ba Yue to Nan Yue and establishes his own little country with his 500,000 of his best friends. And this is kind of interesting because this word translated into into Vietnamese is Nam. This is translated into Viet. So it's Nam Viet, Southern people from far away. And we'll talk a little bit in the future about how that actually gets turned around because there's an actual event that turns that around. But that's about 1,000 years from now, and we don't have long. So this gentleman comes and he kind of invades, but he does more of a hands-off type of approach. It's not a full-scale military intervention. He marries one of the local women. He encourages all of his men to marry one of the local women. He encourages the local chieftains to become sovereign, maintain their sovereignty. He doesn't want to be involved in what they do. He allows people to keep their own land. So in essence, we're here, we're governing, but for the vast majority of people who are Vietnamese of origin, you go ahead and go on with your lives as you want to. But we're going to be in charge. He has more of a hands-off approach to dealing with the people of Vietnam at the time. Now, something interesting happens after about 90 years. This gentleman right here, Emperor Zhao Qing, is General Cao Cao's great-grandson. And he has continued to rule with more of a hands-off approach. We don't want anything, we don't want an uprising from the Vietnamese people. Well, he has a prime minister named Liu Jia. And Liu Jia decides he does not agree with the policies of Emperor Zhao. Now, something's happening here. We had the Qin dynasty, now we have the Han dynasty. And Emperor Zhao in Vietnam, he sees the writing on the wall. And he thinks, I better go up there and give them a little bit of my fealty so they don't overrun us. So he's about to swear his allegiance to the emperor of the Chinese Han dynasty. Say, yo, you're the boss. We're here for you. Well, Prime Minister Liu Jia doesn't like that, so he kills him. And in doing so, the emperor of the Han dynasty realizes he has lost an opportunity for a peaceful transition of power from the Vietnamese people under the Chinese. And apparently this irritates him a little bit because he sends a few 100,000 troops down to find this gentleman and then cuts off his head just to make a point of it. So the Chinese don't respond well to this. But in this process, we start the first era of northern domination. And this is what changes. The General Cao and his family ruled the country very hands-off. The Chinese, they don't come with a military invasion. They come with a colonization invasion. In other words, they bring more than soldiers. They bring business people. They bring farmers. They bring prisoners of war. They bring prisoners. Everyone. They, in essence, bring a presence that's greater than that of any single military. In other words, we're going to assimilate you, and we're going to do it in your backyard. That's basically the approach they're going to use. And they do many things, because you just can't send people. You got to be in charge. And some of the things they do under political administration, initially, Vietnam was a chieftain tribe type orientation. And the interesting thing about it, it was matriarchal in nature. Women had a great deal of power in senior levels in Vietnam. Chinese weren't up for that. Agriculture is kind of interesting because remember I told you the general said, y'all keep your farmland. When the Chinese showed up, they said, your farmland? It's my farmland now. Apparently this irritates people when you take their home and property. It bothers them, but that's the way they... So what we see is this, in this assimilation, we see the roots of revolution. We see the roots of we were autonomous and you're taking it away. And do you have a question back there?
Yes, I do.
Oh, that's my beautiful wife, Cheryl. Hello, Cheryl. What's up?
Hi, Matt. Did the Chinese consider that region part of their empire, or just like a little, go make money, we're gonna run you now?
I think that that's difficult because at various periods in history, you will see that in this period, they were trying to assimilate it into their empire. But we'll go later in the presentation where they will find out that it is not in their best interest to actually rule or control the Vietnamese people. It's in their best interest to do business with the Vietnamese people. So it's not always the same thing. It changes based on economies, based on militaries, based on shifting power bases. And I didn't plant that question. She asked that all on her own. So. Yes, sir.
What was the influence to Cambodia and Laos during that period of time?
I'll be honest with you, I really don't know, but at certain points, the one thing I can tell you is the General Zhao, part of his influence prior to coming to Vietnam was to conquer parts of Southeast Asia. So let's see, Laos is the farther north. He may have conquered in Laos. He also reconquered lands because these borders aren't fixed like we consider them today. They moved. So he may have actually been in Laos. A little later on, we'll talk about actual formal incidences where Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and Myanmar are all part of the discussion in Vietnam. But at this point in history, so I really can't tell you how extensive Chinese influence was in the rest of Southeast Asia. Okay, so we have cultural change, and I want to talk about culture a little bit because one of the things China did, they influenced Vietnam more than any other country in its history. They brought administrative processes, educational processes, agricultural processes. They brought all of that. And part of it's this thing called Confucianism, which some folks call religion, some folks call philosophy. But to them, it was a form of governance, and it was a form of maintaining society in an orderly manner. So they superimposed that on the Vietnamese. Yet another thing that made them incredibly happy. But one of the things they did was they underestimated this relationship, the chieftain relationship. And as I told you, it was matriarchal, so we're going to tell a little story here. There was a Chinese political administrator named Su Ding. And he got angry at one of the noble landowners from one of the chieftains, and he beheaded this woman's husband. Well, she didn't take that lying down. She and her sister raised an army, about 1 million elephants and 1.5 million guys, and they went in and they literally cast the Chinese out of Vietnam. These two women together formed an army that actually drove the Chinese out of Vietnam. It did not go well for this individual as he ran back to China with his tail between his legs, and he then realized that he had miscalculated the power of women in the military, in the government, in the governance of Vietnam. Not a good thing, but there's a downside to the story. For about 2 or 3 years, Vietnam had independence. Not really. This was a running battle in which the emperor, the non-emperor, tried to find these two women, and eventually they did. And they cut this women's heads off. They beheaded them for their action. Okay, you've kind of cut the head off the serpent, and you've created 2 martyrs. So, what happens is, the Han Dynasty now knows something. They have martyrs they have to deal with, but they also realize they respect the Vietnamese, but we can't do this in a civilized manner. We need to be a little more oppressive. So they send an amazing military presence where not only do we have some colonization, we're going to put you under the thumb of the Chinese military. And so for 400 years, we have a period called the Second Era of Northern Domination, in which there was very little uprising, revolution, or oppression by the people of Vietnam. They were pretty much under the Chinese thumb. Then something happens in around 542. And this is another period where, once again, Vietnam uprises against the Chinese people. Now, what is the common theme that we have so far in everything I've said? Vietnam wants one thing. Independence. Independence. I want you to keep that in mind. Independence. So what happens is during a weakening of the Non Dynasty, and it's kind of interesting when you read Chinese history, you think it's stayed and through 3,000 years. These people were always fighting one another for control of the country called China. And I say the country called China because these borders ebb and flow, as I said earlier. Well, what happened at some point is there was so much disharmony, so much civil war in China that the Vietnamese people saw an opportunity. This gentleman right here, Li Bi, he saw an opportunity to rebel against China. Now, the interesting thing about Li Bi, he's Chinese. He's Chinese. What you're starting to see is now, as the Chinese and the Vietnamese mix, after a time, I'm not a Chinese person living in Vietnam. I'm a Vietnamese person, because the China I knew was 200 years behind me. There was another country that did that, where immigrants came to that country and they became something that they weren't before. Okay, on St. Patrick's Day, they dye the river green and do stuff like, I can't remember the name of that country. What's that? In Chicago. Yeah, I just don't remember the name of the country that brought in immigrants and they all became something different. But they did something similar here. The thing that's interesting about Li Bi is one of the distinctions, and I'm going to just preface something here. Most of what I have told you thus far has probably been written through a Chinese perspective, because through much of Vietnamese history, there's very little written Vietnamese record of what actually happened. So it's told through the eyes of someone else. So it may be jaded. We don't know. That's the problem. It was a past. We really don't know what happened. But what he did, and what the account is, it's very famous, he understood that even though we're rebelling, the Chinese are bigger, badder, faster, better armed. So he started to use terrain and guerrilla tactics to fight against the Chinese. And the thing that made him very renowned was the use of these tactics of a smaller, more versatile, more deployable force against a larger, more stagnant force. And so that's what one of the things Li Bi was known for. But he did manage to expel the Chinese for just a small period of time. And he managed to establish an independent kingdom called Ban Zhuan. I hope I got that right. We see these periods of history. We're in the second era of northern domination. Let's keep going. This one isn't quite as renowned. And what you notice is that over time, the power of China kind of went like this in terms of Vietnam. Now the power of China is starting to wane. It waxes, it wanes. And this is a period, why is it waning? For the same reason it did before. Because there were different dynasties, the Tang, and there were some others here, they were all vying to rule Vietnam. That's good, because the Vietnamese now have an opportunity, because there is no consolidated power to fight against. And what happens is the Vietnamese people manage to once again push out the Chinese. But this is the other thing I read and I noted, and this is why I put this bullet in. And I think I kind of revealed this a little bit earlier. What they've really started to note at this point in history, there is a great number of Vietnamese who are Vietnamese. There is a great number of Chinese who are now Vietnamese and do not recognize themselves as Chinese anymore, because that was my great-great-great-great-grandfather. That's not me. And what you also see at this point, when that happens, the individual's vested interest is no longer with the past, it's with the present. So in essence, when China, as history progressed, when China invaded Vietnam, they were fighting people whose ancestry was Chinese. When the United States incurred in World War II, we were fighting people whose ancestors had come to the United States. That's just the nature of the thing. But I like using that because we became a conglomeration of something different. And I guess my point is, at this point in history, Vietnam had become something different than when it was when the Chinese started their enterprise. I want to talk a little bit about the Mongols. This guy here, does anyone know who that is? The most famous of Mongols.
Genghis Khan.
Kublai Khan.
Kublai Khan.
Kublai Khan, a little older. Kublai Khan's interesting because Kublai Khan wanted all of it. He wanted all of it. His eyes were bigger than his stomach. One of the things that Kublai Khan was focused during this period in history was in the conquest of China and Japan. And at this point, his empire was at the peak and starting to wane, but he still wanted these treasures. He didn't have a lot of interest in Vietnam, but what the heck? It was on the way. So he decided to, in order to conquer China, here's China. He was making great progress up here. He decided, I'm going to pincer the Chinese royal dynasty. So what he did initially was he sent troops into Dai Viet, northern Vietnam. Now note how we're talking right now about a lot of things in history that happened up here in the Red River Delta, northern Vietnam. He decides, I'm going to send troops to the south here, and I'm going to pincer China here from the north and from the south. And it was a great plan until he found out that Vietnam had a lot of diseases, a lot of swamps, and people who were not real friendly towards having him there. And that basically limited his ability to pincer China at this time because, in essence, his armies had to retreat because, like I said, the other factors in Vietnam, where the attrition rate was such that it was not viable for him to continue operations in this area of Vietnam. But he has ambitions. He's an ambitious guy. He says, well, if I can't beat him this way, I'm going to make an even bigger plan. And I'm going to invade Vietnam, not really Vietnam, or not Dai Viet, this little area here called Champa. And Champa is a culturally distinct part of this thing we recognize as Vietnam from Dai Viet. It's different. His idea is twofold. Well, since I failed in pressuring the Chinese from here, I'm going to pressure them from a few hundred miles south, and I'm just going to press through the people who stopped me the first time. He's thinking this through. So he also has another plan, and that is from here, he's going to launch an invasion of Japan. So he has a lot of ambition. Unfortunately, he's not as organizationally or logistically capable as he thinks he is. So this pretty much stalls, because apparently the people of Champa were no less thrilled to have the Chinese on their real estate than the people of Dai Viet. This also stalled because his area of power up here didn't do much to support. He decided to do part of his invasion by sea, and an invasion, your Navy, correct me if I'm wrong, an invasion by the Navy doesn't work if the Navy never shows up, right? That's kind of what happened here. The Navy kind of got blown off course, and they never found Champa. And by the time they did, the people of that land had pretty much forced the Chinese out of their area. But he's not done yet. He said, third time is a charm. What I'm going to do is, once again, I am going to attack from both the land and the sea into this area, the Red River Delta. Now let me explain. The Red River Delta is it's the breadbasket of Vietnam. Part of the reason they want that is because it is basically a source of food, and a very highly contested part of Southeast Asia is very valuable. And that's why the Vietnamese are willing to fight to the end for it, because it is that valuable. But he decides, I'm going to have one more go at these people. So he decides he's going to send 94,000 Mongols via ship into this river right here. Now, what did I say about the Navy not showing up?
Doesn't work if they.
Doesn't work. Okay, they're 0 for 2. They show up late. But what basically happens, without getting into the details, is as part of their sea attack, the Vietnamese Navy, in essence, destroys them. It's the Spanish Armada to the Mongol Empire. They basically, really, the Mongols sail these enormous boats up the river. They're chasing these little Vietnamese canoes until all the boats run aground in the shallows. And then the Vietnamese destroy them. And not to be deterred, they send another set of big boats up, which suffer the same fate. And this basically, Kubla's thinking, I'm on a decline, I'm losing power, maybe I'll just let this one go. So you see there was a very brief period where the Mongol Empire, at one time considered one of the most powerful forces in Asia, was turned aside by the people of Vietnam. They want their independence. But there's still one last chapter left. And this is really the end of the end. The Vietnamese have a Tron dynasty, which is deposed. And this is a strange fate, but the emperor of the Tron dynasty decides, I'm going to ask for some Chinese assistance. So the Chinese like, okay, you want us back? We're coming. They send 215,000 troops back to help the Tron dynasty overcome the people that are trying to conquer them. Guess what happens when the Chinese show up? They stay. This doesn't bode well for anybody, because basically the Tron dynasty of Vietnam gave them a green light to invade our country and take it over. And the Chinese were thinking, that's acceptable. But all of a sudden the Tron dynasty decides, wow, we've made a mistake. And they start a civil war against the Chinese people who are there. And what the Chinese start to decide is that this is costing us a lot of money. So what we're going to do is we're going to withdraw. And I'll tell you what, for our withdrawal, if you pay the Chinese tribute every year, we'll leave you alone. What did you say? Ask about money? Who asked about economics? It's all about money. Yeah. As opposed to fighting with Gary, I'll tell you what, why don't you just pay me $10 every month and we'll call it a day. That's in essence what happened. But by doing that, the Chinese ended their period of 1,000 years. I want you to note that, 1,000 years of Chinese domination. They realized it was more profitable to have an economic ally than to have a military conquest. And so we move on. The French. It's the French's turn. The French show up in 1615 with Jesuit priests, with religious people, under the guise of wanting to convert people to Catholicism. The reality, they've been sent by the monarch to open trade routes, because this is the period of trade and exploration in Europe, and everybody is anxious to get their time in Southeast Asia. So they send French Jesuit priests who try and influence, and for a time are successful influencing, Vietnamese policy and Vietnamese religion and culture. In fact, they assist in establishing something called the Nguyen dynasty. They kind of helped the first emperor, they kind of helped his family become predominant in Vietnam. But the Nguyen dynasty starts to realize something. This influence comes with a cost. And that is, the more influence you have in my country, the less influence I have in my country. So what they attempt to do is they attempt to expel all the Jesuit priests, all the Catholic influence in Vietnam. And when this gets back to France, the King of France decides, I've had enough of this nonsense, takes off the gloves and invades Vietnam. He's done playing, okay, we're just going to do this the military way. And they are successful. They invade Vietnam, and they get a foothold in this area down here, Cochin China, I'm not sure. This area is where they start their military and colonial conquest of Vietnam. That's where the French start. And the interesting thing about it, what did the French have to destroy in order to be successful? The very dynasty they helped build some 80 years earlier. And they are very successful in doing so. Not. Because You overthrew the dynasty, but apparently the people of Vietnam think of you the same way they think of the Chinese. They're not interested in you being here. This starts 87 years of colonial war between the French and the Vietnamese people. And what happens basically is the French start here. They conquer this part. The Chinese come from the south. They conquer the Chinese. So what do they have? They have ownership of all of this. They managed to have full scope ownership of this country we look at now as Vietnam. So they've really kind of conquered the Vietnamese, at least in their minds they have. I'd like to talk to you about someone, because he has a different idea. He needs to be talked about, because he's probably the most important influence in Vietnamese history. This man right here, Ho Chi Minh. He's a very interesting individual. I have this thing. You don't have to like your enemy. You have to respect your enemy. You have to understand them. And that's why I want to bring this, and I used the wrong word. I should have said your opponent, the person who is against you. Because if you don't respect them and underestimate you, you'll know you'll end up on the canvas staring up at the lights, okay? This gentleman was born and educated in Vietnam, and he was educated by the French. He's multilingual, he's worldly, but he's also unwelcome because he led political events against the people of France, and he was expelled from the country for 10 years, he was expelled around 1911, and he spent the next 40 years in exile in France and other places. So, in 1918, after the end of World War I, does anyone remember what Woodrow Wilson brought to the world after World War I?
League of Nations.
The League of Nations, right? That man right there said, this is our opportunity for the world to recognize Vietnamese independence. So he wrote a letter to Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations, and said, please allow Vietnam to be independent. Now this is, I'm going to get into something, if you don't like it, but the world didn't see countries like Vietnam as independent countries. They saw them as colonies, as things to be controlled, because the League of Nations was a Western concept. So I don't know what actually happened, but his petition was turned aside. United States, Woodrow Wilson, first time. So what happens is he needs a dogma to continue forward, because his goal is independent Vietnam. You can cut it down, you can strip it, you can do whatever you want. He wants one thing, independent Vietnam. I want you to keep that in mind, because that is the theme of the rest of this presentation. So his leanings, he finds a leaning he likes, communism. And they greet him with open arms. In fact, he even goes to Moscow to become a better communist. So an opportunity lost? I don't know. He's a founding member of the French Communist Party, and he traveled to Moscow in something called the International, which was basically a process of indoctrinating people from outside of Russia, the Soviet Union, in communist dogma and doctrine. And he stays outside of Vietnam until 1941. He's just living everywhere, but not Vietnam. Then something happens. World War II. What happened to the French in 1940? That's right. They got invaded and conquered by the Germans. Now, as part of that process, the Japanese see an opportunity. France is struggling for its life. It's not all that interested in this Vietnam thing right now. It has its own problems. So the Japanese decide this is our time. And what they in essence do is they invade Southeast Asia. Their reach far exceeds Vietnam. This is Laos, this is Cambodia, this is Thailand. They basically own this entire area. Now, what happens here is that Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam, and he forms something called the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh is an army, a group of people who are opposed to first the Japanese in Vietnam. He sees this like a chess game. What's that old saying? The enemy of my enemy is my friend or my ally. So who does he invite to help him throw the Japanese out of Vietnam.
The Americans.
Later, initially, you're right, later, but initially who was it? The Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese, who, by the way, are in their own little civil war with the communist Mao Zedong, right? But they send help. So now he's now using the Chinese opponent as my enemy of my enemy, because the Chinese have no love lost for either the Japanese, who invaded them around the turn of the 20th century, or the French for any other reasons, because they've gone to war and lost territory to the French as well. So they're agreeable to this. But at this time, another thing happens is Ho Chi Minh, like you're right, he sought American assistance. You're absolutely right. We're going to get to that in just a second. The first thing we need to think of is he sought American assistance, but we didn't provide it until near the end of the war, 1945. The OSS brought in advisors, the American predecessor to the CIA. Did I get that right, Don? The predecessor, yeah, the OSS. I want to make sure I got that right. He brings these people in to assist in training the Vietnamese to fight the Japanese. Well, now, the war ends because we dropped 2 atom bombs on the Japanese, and they've decided they've had enough. But an interesting thing comes of it, and that is this. One of the leadership, and I pulled this especially because I thought it was very insightful. This gentleman, Archimedes Patty, I'm not sure his exact role, but he wrote something very insightful for distribution through the American government. I'm going to read it to you. Ho Chi Minh impresses me. He is sensible, well-balanced, well-minded, politically minded individual. His demands are few and simple, namely independence and liberation from French rule and the right to live freely. He then goes on to write, from what I have seen, these people mean business, and I am afraid that the French will have to deal with them. For that matter, we, the United States, will also have to deal with them. This was more than 10 years before America's first official intervention in Vietnam. Somebody saw the writing on the wall. So, at this point, during the American intervention in Vietnam, the Chinese nationalists said, you know what we'll do for you, Vietnam? We'll do better than just help you in a war. Why don't you become part of us? And I'm going to just jump to this slide. Remember, the Chinese nationalists asked whether the Vietnamese want to become part of China. I'm going to read this one to you. You fools, don't you realize what it means if the Chinese remain? Don't you remember your history? The last time the Chinese came, they stayed 1,000 years. The French are foreigners. They are weak. Colonialism is dying. The white man is finished in Asia. But if the Chinese stay, they will never leave. To drive his point home, he continues with me, and I blipped this. As for me, I'd prefer to sniff French feces for 5 years than eat Chinese feces for the rest of my life. He had no intention of doing anything with the Chinese other than using them for his own political, military, and independence needs. So I thought I'd let you, that really reaffirms the single-mindedness of this individual, okay? And we're going to go back here a little bit, and we're going to end we're actually going to start the French Indochina War, the first one, the French. What happens at the end of World War II is that Ho Chi Minh says, we are the independent Republic of Vietnam. Neither the United States nor Great Britain recognized his republic. Second time he's been turned aside by the United States. And I put Operation Mastodon up here. The reason I did that is the importance of having Great Britain not recognize Ho Chi Minh's government was because they were one of the primary agents in reorganizing Vietnam after World War II. In other words, they were the people who were going to flush the Japanese out of the country. They did that in a peaceful meaning. It's not a war thing. They were just responsible for it because they were the allies, they were the victors. But in doing so, they gave very little credence to Minh and his government. Yet another thing that made them happy. And what happened was that Minh's government refuses a reunification request by the British and the Americans. And now we start to have this unofficial division at the 16th parallel, it's starting to look like the country we recognized around Vietnam time, right? Where the South is governed by, the North is governed by the Viet Minh, and the South is governed by Bao Dai, which is in essence an on-again, off-again puppet government used by the Western world to govern Vietnam. So I'm going to skip ahead to these slides. I had to read those. I thought that is so pressing of what this individual is thinking. We're going to talk about the French Restoration in Vietnam. What's the only thing Ho Chi Minh wants? He wants independence. The French think they're going back to business as usual.
Colonization.
We're just your colony. From World War I to World War II, that perception did not change. So what happened was the French at some point requested and demanded that they be able to take over administration of all of Vietnam from both the Chinese and Britain. And what was the first thing they did? They restored French Indochina. Recognize that from about 70 years earlier? French Cochinchina as part of Vietnam. And here's the rest of Vietnam right here. So the French are coming in and thinking it's going back to business as usual, which I never really understood because there was never really a peace. They were occupiers, and that starts to wear people out after a while. So the other thing they want from this is these are countries in Europe that were great nations for hundreds of years. France was a world power. It has influence. Look at the countries in Africa that speak French. They want that prestige back. Their country's in ruins, but they want that prestige. What's part of that prestige? Vietnam. So they come back. Well, apparently Ho Chi Minh had a different plan, as did the North Vietnamese. The problem was they had in the North a plan and a passion. What the French had was a puppet government, which did not have the same values, which did not have the same power or affirmation that the North Vietnamese had. So some things are happening in the world, okay? Other things. The first thing that happens in the North is the Chinese communists defeat the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek, which is interesting because Chiang Kai-shek offered assistance to Vietnam. But what happens here, that plays right into Ho Chi Minh's hand because he's a communist. So now he has a big communist neighbor just north of him. And the second thing that happened is the Chinese come to the aid of Ho Chi Minh in his fight against the French. So now the French are fighting the Vietnamese and the Chinese. So guess who's the next party who's going to get into this mess? You guessed, right, the United States. But before that can happen, the Korean War happens. The Korean War breaks out between North and South Korea. The North is aligned with the Chinese. The South is aligned with the United States. So for a small period of time, both of those countries, their interests, go away from Vietnam. So the French end up going tete-a-tete with the Vietnamese pretty much by themselves. Because we were busy in Korea, as were the Chinese, we didn't have a lot of assets to offer. But then the war ends. Not really. I don't think that war ever officially ended, did it? It's an armistice right now.
It never officially started.
Never officially started, so it can't really end, can it?
Same with the Vietnam War. We never declared war.
Okay. And that's a great precursor because we're going to get to that towards the end of the presentation. So what happens is the Korean armistice is signed. And what also happens is the United States and the rest of the Western world has a way of perceiving the future. And that is a world of capitalism, democracy, whatever you want to call it, and a world of communism. It's become a bilateral this or that. At the same time, the United States starts to finance French operations, starts to intervene during the periods of Truman and Eisenhower. Nothing official. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Sorry, I just like that you used the word perceived, because technically the Soviets never actually recognized Ho Chi Minh, and they didn't recognize the Chinese as actual communists.
Okay.
And neither did Khrushchev later on.
Okay.
So I'm glad I used that word, because everybody always believes the communists are communists. Everybody had hand.
Okay. No, and I appreciate that. And I look at that as a convenience of aligning interests and nothing more than that. Because I think there would be some difficulty in defining what communism actually is. So it's different things to different people, but thank you for that point. So what happens during this period of neither a lot of United States or Chinese intervention? The French and the Vietnamese are getting tired of killing each other. This is getting old. The French people, their government is in disarray, and they are having the same problems we had 20 years later. They don't want to be in Vietnam any longer.
We also had a similar war going on in Algeria.
Okay.
So it was very similar to what was going on in Vietnam, so I think that was drawing away resources.
Okay. So the French are trying to their reach exceeds their grasp, is what you're saying. Yes, sir.
At that same time where they got their funding through the Marshall Plan, and the plan was to contain communism.
Okay.
And that's where all this money and all these influences went in, because they wanted to do a containment policy, and that was George C. Marshall and Lee Truman Eisenhower were in that group. And they made a big, and that's where all our justification came about with the creation of NATO, CETO, and all those treaties to contain communism.
Wait, did you guys give him the slides before this presentation? It's like he's reading my mind. No, you're absolutely right. We're going to talk about that in just a few short seconds. But let's get the French out of Indochina first, shall we? And it happens right here at Dien Bien Phu. I'm not going to talk anything about the battle, but it is the end of the French in Vietnam. Dien Bien Phu breaks French will to fight in Southeast Asia. The French and the Vietnamese are now vying for position. They know that peace is coming. They want to be the best place to get the best terms. So they decide to square off at Dien Bien Phu. And to the French have a bit of arrogance. They really think they're going to build an airstrip in the middle of the jungle and supply an army. They're an airstrip. I'm sure the Vietnamese chuckled at that just a little bit. They also have 60 artillery pieces. And they think that the surrounding hills are impenetrable. And this is beautiful, because that's not how the Vietnamese see it. They haul over 300 artillery pieces. They take them apart and carry them by hand and put them in the jungle. The French can't bomb these sites because they don't know where they are, and they can't see them from the air. So the French, think of it, the French are in the middle of the bowl, and the Vietnamese are all around the top. Who do you think has the advantage? Okay? The French underestimated Vietnam's ability, Viet Minh's ability to position and fight. And what happened? The French lost. Now, people who look at war like a football game say it appears that the French won. In the words of Vogue Gap, yeah, you killed more of us than we did of you. So what? Little different view on how war is fought.
Sounds like a U.S. body count.
It does. The Vietnamese took great losses, but they won the day. And that's how you have to look at things. It's not like the end of regulation. You have more points than I do. It doesn't work like that. Because this is what happens. It ends the French will to fight in Vietnam. But the other thing, it gives Vietnam an idea. We can beat a Western power. We may have lost, but we can win. Because all we have to do is outlast you. So we have the Geneva Court, and everyone shows up for these, and this kind of draws the boundaries for a North and a South Vietnamese formally, leading up to our incursion into Vietnam. And it basically draws a border between North and South Vietnam on the 17th parallel, creates a DMZ. The French withdraw completely to be replaced by the Americans. And what the idea is that we will divide this country until 1956, and then you'll have a formal election, and you're all going to become one country. Ho Chi Minh wanted to do that, but not the way we wanted to, so that really didn't come to pass. And by the way, we're going to allow free movement of citizens for 300 days from the side, and this is what's interesting. Free movement of citizens north to south, south to north. 90,000 people fled from the north to the south. 90,000? And French troops were forced from Vietnam. Now, this is the point I think I already said. They traded in the French for the United States. So we now officially have a dog in the fight. It's not going to be a peaceful thing to come. South Vietnam, capital at Saigon, North Vietnam at Hanoi. And as part of this agreement, the Viet Minh would withdraw from South Vietnam. They went north, and they went down something you may have heard of called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Cambodia and Laos. So during the Vietnam War, why did we bomb in those countries? Because that was the main supply route to South Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh, they retreated. Everyone said that's good, and then they just started reinvading from the south. They didn't go across the DMZ, they just went around the DMZ. So nothing has really progressed. Ho Chi Minh has not, the people of North Vietnam have not changed their agenda.
Why were there 90,000 people that fled the north for the south at that same time?
Because I'm not really sure that the North was a political undertaking. I'm not sure it was exactly for the people. But Mike wants to tell me something, so I'm going to let Mike say it.
Well, many of those who fled south were Catholic.
That's right.
Yeah, they were much, the French had been there for a long time. You wanted to rise in society. You had lots of priests and stuff. So there was a major reason for that.
Yeah, and 90,000 is probably a smaller percentage of the actual population.
And thank you, Mike. You know, when you're up speaking sometimes, and you have someone ask a question or make a comment, that's really work. But sometimes it's like catching a fish. Mike just jumped in the boat for me. I appreciate it, because we're going right there in the next slide. Thank you so much. In fact, we're going there in this slide. Okay, many of the people from North Vietnam come to the south. And what the United States is scared of is these two things. You talked about containment a minute ago, right? We have to contain communism because we have had varying success. Most of Eastern Europe is now communist. We need to contain it in Southeast Asia. And we're also concerned with something, a political theory called the domino effect. If one country falls to communism, all the countries around it. So we have to contain it and keep it from spreading because we do have success and we do have failure. John Kennedy was there during the building of the Berlin Wall. That was a failure. Laos, Cambodia, failures. But we did have a success. The Korean War. We didn't win anything, but we did keep communism out of Southern Korea. So it's a mixed bag at this point. And based on what Mike just told us about Catholics coming from the north to south, they were hoping to have some type of religious freedom. Unfortunately, the government of Diem, right here, this gentleman right here, went from being a puppet government to being a very dictatorial government that oppressed French people, and it also oppressed other religions. And one of the religions they oppressed were the Buddhists. And you have all probably seen the photo that's a little more famous than this one. This priest catches fire very shortly thereafter in protest of the actions of the government of Diem. And so he's a problem. He's a problem because he's a puppet for the United States. But he's not doing what we want him to do. So we have this wolf by the ears. We can't hold on to him and we can't let him go. But that's okay because the Vietnamese military solves that problem and kills him. Okay, that was the end of it. And there is something that maybe, you know, the CIA may have known something, but who knows? That's another story.
What year was that?
What's that?
About what year was this?
I think it was 1964. It was a year in which he...
Right before the Nixon.
Exactly, and that's exactly where we're going. Because this leaves a power vacuum. For us, a bad leader is better than no leader. So when he is killed, and we're not sure who sanctioned it, there is no power vacuum. Now Southern Vietnam is complete chaos governmentally, which presents an opportunity for North Vietnam to press its agenda into the South. And it becomes this gentleman's problem right here, John F. Kennedy. He is trying to contain communism in Southeast Asia without invading Southeast Asia. Increased military spending, this is one of the areas where Green Berets became very famous as advisors over in Vietnam. He doesn't want war. He doesn't want to put troops on the ground. He really doesn't. And so he has a broad commitment to this. But Minh doesn't change his view. You're going to invade North Vietnam. That's where this is going. He knows it. He continues his action. Well, John F. Kennedy never has the chance to expand policy in Vietnam because on 22 November he's killed and Vice President Lyndon Johnson is sworn in as President of the United States. Interesting thing, I'm going to kind of end up here. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. America's involvement in Vietnam started long before Gulf of Tonkin. Whether it be political, but there was military enterprise in Vietnam, American forces assisting long before 1964. We are already in this. The question is, how in it are we? This incident is the incident that tips the scales towards full-scale action by the United States. The reason that all these fine ladies and gentlemen you heard at the symposium had those stories, because this incident led to their purpose in Vietnam. And that's why I say this is legacy. This was it right here. So let's look at this. And I'm not going to go into the, correct the Navy stuff if I say it wrong, right? Okay. This is a boat, right? I'm sorry, I'm Air Force. I got to get these clarifications. It's a target, okay. You're a submariner. All surface ships are targets, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so this is a target, and it's the USS Maddox. And what happened was the USS Maddox was approached by Vietnamese warships and fired 3 warning shots at them. They ignored those warning shots, and they fired torpedoes at this American ship. That is known as a fact. That happened. But 2 days later, under poor weather, because of bad communications and radar and sonar, there was a supposed, and I'm saying supposed because I don't know and I'm not sure who does know, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy in the Gulf of Tonkin came under attack by Vietnamese warships. And this is where the fog of war gets interesting. The captain of the USS Maddox, after the incident on 4 August, initially said, no action, no contact, nothing happened. A few hours later, he radioed back with a conflicting message that says, we were attacked by the Vietnamese. And it's much more complicated than that, but I just want to boil it down to, you heard that. The fog of war, bad weather, bad communications, who knows what happens. Well,
Go back to that last
yes, sir.
Stockdale, right?
Ah, thank you. Thank you. I almost
He
forgot.
launched against this.
Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead. No, tell it.
He launched against this supposed attack, and
Thank
he
you.
could not find
Thank you.
any enemy vessels.
Thank you for saying that, because I'm going to try and paraphrase what he said. He said, I was flying over top of those vehicles. I had the best seats in the house for this supposed events, and there was nothing but the Navy and Black Sea around it. That was the Black Ocean around it. And you're right, thank you. I almost forgot that. That's,
And then later on was a POW. That
Yes,
was one of
thank
his
you.
biggest fears under torture, that he would divulge that.
Thank you. That is really germane, because you're right. He became, he's a full admiral, is that correct? Full Admiral Stockdale. He's now a commander. I believe he was a commander or a lieutenant commander when this happened. So he actually flew the surveillance and basically, thank you, that's really important. He said nothing happened. And initially, the captain of the ship, he said nothing happened. But then all of a sudden, something happened, which leads us to our next slide. President, on 4 August, the day of the event, President Johnson addresses the nation, and he calls on Congress to give him the power to preserve democracy, to stop communism, to elevate American interaction in Vietnam. And he gets congressional approval of his resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, is signed into war, very specifically to stop communism in Southeast Asia. I'd say Vietnam specifically, Southeast Asia. So what happens is there is a question in retrospect. This gentleman, Robert McNamara, head of the Secretary of Defense at the time, he sells this story to the president. The president goes to Congress, asks for a resolution, which is in essence something short of war, and we're in Vietnam. And that's how it happened. And all the stories you heard, came from that origin. All the stories that you heard at the symposium came from 2,000 years of history of that country. Now, before I close, I want to bring up one more thing, the Pentagon Papers. There's a few people smiling. The Pentagon Papers were in part authored by this gentleman right here, Daniel Ellsberg, who was a war hawk initially, worked for the Rand Corporation, a think tank for the government, initially a war hawk. But he revealed these highly classified report that was requested by Secretary McNamara on the United States action in Vietnam from 1956, I think, to 1967. And basically in doing that, it was an embarrassment for the American government because there was factual evidence that the United States government and its commander-in-chief had lied to the American people. Ladies and gentlemen, I am simply stating that. I am not drawing an opinion. I'm simply telling you what that says. And the reason I close with that is because 58,000 Americans died because of that war. I'd like to close with something. Ho Chi Minh, one final comment before I close. We fought the Chinese for 1,000 years. We fought the French for 100. And you, America, were only here for 10 years. You were just a blip in the long history of a proud nation. And ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Matt. That was a wonderful presentation, great background on the history there. Folks, please, once again, if you have any questions or anything like that, we'll give Matt a couple of minutes because I know just kind of taking a look at the clock, we don't want to run too long. And then after that, maybe individually you can come up if you have some questions or comments or if you want to share in the conversation here. But that was outstanding. I think it gives us a wonderful background, and especially for some of these speakers that we have coming up here in the future, I definitely encourage you to continue this story because it is an amazing story. We have many, many of these veterans, of course, amongst us who are still here, and this war is a huge, huge part of American history, especially for myself. I know that my father always called me a Gulf of Tonkin baby because I was born in '64. So even for someone like myself, the Vietnam War still resonates and has an impact on my life like it does on all. So thank you again, Matt. We have a little gift for you. We know that in the past we've given you some challenge coins for speaking, but we thought we'd give you one of our veterans mugs here.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's wonderful.
Thank you, folks, for coming. That's great. Great job, man.
Thank you.
Also, please stick around, and why not move into the library?
One other thing you can
Yeah.
add to the
Yeah.
repertoire is Cuba.
I didn't think about that. That didn't. You're right. That's an excellent.
That was a paranoid.
No, I tell you what. If I do that again, I will. I'll think about putting that in because that was a very. I didn't think about that during the Kennedy period.
That was that close.
No. Oh, absolutely.
Good.
Thank you. Let me see if I can get it off.
So something recent,
Yes.
the last couple of years of his life, which I think was 67, 68, 69. Here, I'll see if I can get it back together. Ho Chi Minh was actually not much more than kind of like a puppet to the Politburo in North